There's been a lot of talk about interprovincial trade barriers in Canada. According to various reports, these barriers are preventing hundreds of billions of dollars in trade and GDP growth, and are having the same effect as huge tariffs within Canada. Effects that are all the more impactful due to the reduced trade with the United States. Political leaders have promised to remove these barriers and implement completely free trade in Canada within months, if elected. But Canada has been passing legislation to address that same issue since the 90s, and still these barriers persist. So let's look at interprovincial trade barriers. Why do we have them? Why haven't we removed them? And what will it mean to remove them now? Canada's constitution was written with the intention that trade flow freely between provinces. In fact, it bans the use of tariffs on trade between provinces. But the early decades of Canada were defined by the protectionist national policy, which saw not only tariffs imposed on imports from other countries, but also trade barriers between provinces. It wasn't until after the Second World War that provinces were given the ability to regulate their own interprovincial trade agreements. What emerged in the coming decades is a wide array of regulations that reduce the ability of provinces to trade with each other, some done purposefully to protect local businesses or for other similar reasons, and some that have just emerged out of provinces working by themselves without considering other provinces. It's difficult to go into exact specifics on all of the trade barriers because there are so many small specific ones. For example, a toilet seat on a construction site in Ontario has to be able to be lifted, whereas fixed seats are acceptable in other provinces, limiting the trade of fixed toilet seats to Ontario. Part of the challenge in removing these barriers is that no province has a document called My Interprovincial Trade Barriers. I'm going to keep using that toilet seat example. The government at some point was writing a document about regulations around construction sites, and they made a choice about toilet seats. In some other province, someone was writing a document about regulations on high-rise office buildings and wrote in a regulation on some other random product. This happened organically over the last 100+ years since Confederation across all 13 provinces and territories. Meaning that while there are a few general, easily identifiable trade barriers we will talk about in a second, the problem with many of these barriers is even identifying they exist in the first place. Broadly, trade barriers fall into 4 categories. Prohibitive barriers, these are straight-up bans on trade, which only cover a very small number of products in Canada. Alcohol, softwood lumber, and snow crabs being the notable ones. The House of Commons in 2015 estimated this costs alcohol producers millions of dollars every year. It also makes Canada one of the only wine-producing countries that primarily drinks imported wine. Technical barriers. These are when provinces have different specific requirements for products that add complexity or cost, such as labeling requirements or trucking regulations. These can add costs to consumers, as companies have to make specific versions of products for different provinces. A 2016 study estimated trade barriers add between 7.8 to 14.5% to consumer costs. Administrative barriers. These are related to permitting processes, red tape, licensing procedures, etc. The technical and administrative barriers are part of the reason we have so much small and medium business in Canada. It is difficult and costly for companies to expand to other provinces because there are a host of local rules and regulations they have to adhere to. A small business may simply never have the capital required to make such a move, or the income required to pay the additional administrative costs once they expand. Finally, geographic and infrastructure barriers. These mainly involve Canada's vast distances and poor infrastructure. The result is that goods, services, and people have limited mobility in Canada. In some cases, it is easier for a province to trade to the United States, or even across the ocean, than it is for them to trade to the province next door. Canada's first formal attempt to address this was in 1995, with the Agreement on Internal Trade. It prevented provinces from adding new barriers and required them to reduce the rules on certain specified products. This became the Canadian Free Trade Agreement in 2017. Despite this, recent studies have attached huge numbers to provincial trade barriers. Different studies have estimated that they are responsible for between a 6.9 to 21% tariff, cutting national growth long-term by 3 to 8%, and if removed, would bring a gain of $200 billion annually to the country. So why do we still have them? There are a number of reasons, but a lot of it has to do with the provinces. Some barriers are protectionist. In the example of alcohol, opening up trade would shift revenue away from provincial coffers. Local industries often lobby for protectionist barriers because it keeps their industries safe from competition, lessening innovation and competition but protecting local business. It can also simply be a case of a lack of political will. Removing barriers can have far-reaching consequences, and without a significant incentive, the status quo is often good enough. But although removing trade barriers is certain to increase competition, add to economic growth, and increase domestic trade, there are some legitimate questions about whether it's all it has been cracked up to be. First of all, in the media frenzy around trade barriers, it sounds as if the last 30 years of work federally and provincially on increasing interprovincial trade accomplished nothing. That is absolutely not true. The overall list of what is still restricted is quite small and is getting smaller. The federal government eliminated 20 of their 39 remaining exemptions in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement back in February of 2025. Provinces across the country have committed to removing some of their own exemptions. What the private sector and some of the public sector are heavily pushing for is something called mutual recognition. Mutual recognition basically means that if a product or service meets regulations in one province, it meets them in all provinces. Sounds great, right? No red tape, no hoops to jump through, no dispute over toilet seats. There are pros and cons to mutual recognition. The pro is it accomplishes exactly what it's meant to. It effectively removes the vast majority of the barriers preventing a product or service from being sent across provincial borders. But there's a cost. The biggest benefits of mutual recognition go to large businesses, because it creates a regulatory race to the bottom. If a product being approved in one province means it's approved everywhere, then provinces will look to have the lowest regulations to get their product out there fastest and cheapest. Many of these products and services will likely originate in Ontario, Quebec, or BC, lessening local businesses in smaller provinces. This also means fewer rights for workers, lessened environmental regulations, laxer safety rules and requirements for products and things of that nature. The case against mutual recognition is that it removes much of the government and community's ability to regulate what goes on in the province. As corporations push for lower regulations in one province, other provinces will have to adhere to those standards, giving the power to corporations rather than governments and communities. Mutual recognition may not even be necessary. Relative to distance and market size, provinces are already 12 times more likely to trade goods and 30 times more likely to trade services with each other than the US. In fact, Canadian provinces are more likely to trade with other provinces than US states are to trade with other states. According to Statistics Canada, the biggest barriers to interprovincial trade are transportation cost and geography. After all, the East Coast is closer to parts of Europe than it is to BC. This isn't the only argument against removing trade barriers. Without going into extensive detail, there are legitimate criticisms of some of the numbers being thrown around about the impact of lessened trade barriers. The main study referenced by politicians is the one completed by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Critics say not only does the institute have a right-wing bias, but that the methodology by which they come to their conclusions is largely theoretical, relying on false equivalencies between interprovincial trade and Canada-US trade, as well as a number of other assumptions. Essentially, the $200 billion a year figure that is constantly referenced is grossly overstated. Not to mention, although there are certainly some nonsensical trade barriers, many of them exist for a reason. Let's look at trucking regulations, for example. A big complaint with trucking is that spring weight requirements are not consistent across provinces, meaning that at times a trucker has to reduce their load in order to pass through certain provinces. But there's geographical sense to that. Roads in Saskatchewan, which are mainly prairies, have different upkeep requirements than mountainous roads in British Columbia. Another area to consider is dairy, poultry, and eggs. Trade barriers in this case do sometimes drive up prices, and agricultural trade restrictions likely cost the industry close to $2 billion per year. But they also protect smaller farmers. In general, trade barriers protect smaller provinces like PEI from being flooded with products and services from Ontario, which would almost certainly drown out local producers and put them out of business. Eggs is another particularly interesting example when compared with the United States. The US's huge factory farm model, driven by free trade of eggs and poultry between states, allowed for the spread of avian flu at a much faster rate, driving the price of eggs through the roof. Although there are other factors, that didn't happen in Canada, in part because of trade barriers. The takeaway here is that economic benefits are not the only benefits to take into account. One last example, professional accreditations. Dental hygienists in Newfoundland and Labrador can't administer anesthesia. They aren't trained to. But in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they can. Do you really want the accreditation of a dental hygienist in Newfoundland to be recognized in Alberta, and then have that same dental hygienist asked to administer anesthesia? Sometimes the barriers are there for a reason. The Macdonald-Laurier report, which estimated that mutual recognition would boost Canada's GDP by $200 billion per year, also reports that between 1.3 to 1.7% of workers would need to move from their homes to another province or change careers. That number is as high as 5% in Alberta. In a time where employment and affordability are already in question, those numbers are significant. Yet, most of the criticisms of dropping interprovincial trade barriers specifically work to discredit the study by Macdonald-Laurier. And in that regard, the critics have good points. But government agencies, think tanks, and international organizations have all come to the same conclusion with varied studies over the last 10 years or more. Interprovincial trade barriers are slowing productivity and costing Canadians money. How much money may be a bit overblown at times, but it is not negligible. What should also be considered is the cost to local business, as well as social and environmental factors. The decision is not simply economic. So while there are legitimate arguments both for and against taking down trade barriers, there are multiple ways forward. The first is, as I've mentioned, remove barriers more or less entirely, adopt mutual recognition, effectively deregulating large parts of Canadian industry. Many economists favor this model. Deregulation comes with its host of human, environmental, and social costs, but it helps to build big business. In Canada, nearly 98% of business is small business, so big business is something the country could probably use. The other option, that isn't really being talked about in media coverage or political talking points, is regulation, but better regulation. Canada already has a system in place for this, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. As I mentioned earlier, the federal government has already used that agreement very recently to remove more than half of their remaining trade exemptions. Canada's federal government could instead work together with the provinces to address specific grievances and create countrywide minimum requirements for various industries. This would allow provincial governments to continue to protect some of their local business, ensure that their products and services meet acceptable standards, and generally continue to have some control over their industries, rather than handing the reins to the private sector. The difficulty is this almost certainly won't happen. Although Canada's internal free trade agreements have made positive steps, getting provinces to agree on a countrywide standard has been impossible for the last 30 years, and even with the changing global landscape isn't likely to happen now. Whatever Canada does, there are a few key takeaways. Interprovincial trade barriers exist. Some of them are frankly stupid and should be removed. Some of them are important and protect workers and consumers. Removing them, although economically impactful, will not result in a golden age of prosperity never before seen in this country. Why? Because they simply don't have as big of an impact on the economy as is being portrayed. And a huge portion of the most impactful trade barriers have already been removed. Canada's economic response will have to be varied to address the wide number of reasons why the country's growth has stagnated over the last 20 years. No matter how they respond, working closely with the provinces will be at the heart of much of it.